The March 1st movement, the Cries for Korean independence.
The March 1st movement, also known as the Mansei demonstrations or the Tamil movement, was a series of demonstrations that swept through the Korean peninsula in order to protest Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945.
The March 1st movement was paramount because it led to the birth of the Korean Provisional Government while also unifying the Koreans with a strong sense of nationalism. It also exposed Japan's conduct towards Korea and sparked other non-violent demonstrations. Conflict between Korea and Japan has always been present, dating back to ancient times. One example is the Imjin Wars, also called the Pottery Wars. This was a prolonged struggle that lasted from 1592 to 1598 CE, when Japanese forces led by Toyotomi Hideyoshi attacked Korea with the eventual goal of taking over the Ming Dynasty of China.
With the help of the Ming Army and the brilliant command of Naval Admiral Lee Sun-shin, Korea was able to drive the Japanese out.
In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were multiple events that led to the March 1st movement. Two of these were the Sino-Japanese War fought from 1894 to 1895 between the Chinese and the Japanese, and the Russo-Japanese War fought from 1904 to 1905 between the Russians and the Japanese.
Both ended in Japanese victory and ultimately led to Japan becoming the superior power in East Asia. Korea was vulnerable for attack from Japan because it was very weak at the time. Korea was officially annexed on August 22, 1910, when Japan forced the Korean representative to sign the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910.
Another event that caused the movement was the 14-point speech given by President Woodrow Wilson on January 8, 1918, which outlined Wilson's vision for lasting peace in Europe and the rest of the world after the end of World War I. Korean independence leaders looked to the 14 points as an inspiration to fight for freedom.
The last event that led to the March 1st movement was the sudden death of Emperor Gojong on January 21, 1919. Many Koreans suspected foul play and thought the emperor had been poisoned, since there had been previous assassination attempts on him. In the early hours of March 1, 1919, thousands of flyers and copies of the newly drawn-up Declaration of Korean Independence were distributed throughout the Korean peninsula. On the same day, at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a student named Chung Jae-young read aloud the Proclamation of Korean Independence in Pagoda Park, where a large crowd had gathered. The declaration had been drawn up by Cho Nam-son and signed by 33 Korean nationalist leaders.
After the proclamation, the assembly then repeatedly shouted "Manse," or "Long Live Korea." The crowd then dispersed, spreading out to other cities around the Korean peninsula to help protest Japanese rule. Representatives read the proclamation at rallies all over Korea, and marches were soon packed with demonstrators waving Korean flags and shouting "Manse." During the next few months, protesters organized more non-violent rallies all over Korea.
However, the Japanese reacted with brutality and force. The Japanese military arrested around 47,000 protesters, including all 32 nationalist leaders. The Japanese officials fired into the crowds of marchers and violently beat whoever they arrested.
그래서 외할아버지가 일본 놈들한테 고문을 많이 당하고 해가지고 일찍 돌아가셨어.
In the Jimry massacre, which happened on April 15, 1919, villagers of Jimry were forced into a church by the Japanese. The doors of the church were barred shut and the church was set on fire. Anyone who tried to escape through the windows was shot by the waiting Japanese soldiers outside. There were no survivors in this dreadful tragedy.
By the time the movement was fully suppressed by the Japanese, about 12 months later, around 2 million Koreans had participated in more than 1,500 protests all over the country. During the time of the protests, around 7,500 people were killed and 16,000 more were wounded. 715 private houses, 47 churches, and 2 schools were destroyed.
All the tactics that the Japanese Imperial Army would eventually take to conquer North China in the 1930s, they had essentially tested on the Korean countryside in the 1910s. And these are the famous burn all, kill all, rape all tactics.
A figure that is widely celebrated in Korea is Yu Gun-sun, a student at a women's school in Seoul. After the start of the demonstrations, she went from village to village with a smuggled copy of the Declaration of Independence and read it out loud to the crowds, encouraging them to stage protests of their own. Yu was arrested by the Japanese and was beat to death. She was 17 at the time. In prison, she famously wrote, "Even if my fingernails are torn out, my nose and ears are ripped apart, and my legs and arms are crushed, This physical pain does not compare to the pain of losing my nation. My only remorse is not being able to do more than dedicating my life to my country.
Even though the March 1st movement failed to bring immediate independence to Korea, it was a triumph because it unified the Koreans in a way it had never been before, and strengthened their sense of nationalism.
The movement also led to the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government, which was founded in Shanghai in September of 1919. The Provisional Government was founded by the nationalist leaders who had escaped Korea to avoid arrest. The KPG was the first democratic republican government of Korea, and acted as a foundation for South Korea's government. The KPG also organized groups to fight for independence, such as the Korean Liberation Army, which fought with the Allies against the Japanese forces during World War II.
Many organizations helped bring recognition to the situation in Korea, including the Korean Nationalist Association, which petitioned the Paris Peace Conference to bring attention to the Japanese occupation of Korea. However, the Allied forces declined to take action. Though this attempt failed, organizations still managed to gain worldwide attention and expose Japan's cruel treatment towards Korea. The Japanese Empire continued to rule Korea all the way till the end of World War II. Even after the March 1st movement, Korea still suffered under Japanese rule, which was a dark and oppressive time for the country and its citizens. Many Korean women, along with women from other countries that were under Japanese rule, were kidnapped and forced to become comfort women, or sexual slaves for the Japanese men in the military during the war.
While the exact number is unknown, it is estimated that 20,000 to 410,000 women were forced to become comfort women, and many died through STIs, violent abuse, inhumane living conditions, and suicide.
Korea was finally liberated from Japanese rule on August 15, 1945, when Japan officially surrendered to the Allies. The northern half of Korea was temporarily occupied by the Soviet Union and China, while the south was occupied by the United States. The separation of the Korean peninsula greatly contributed to the start of the Korean War, which was an awful tragedy.
The North, led by Kim Il-sung, attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950. The war ended in a stalemate on July 27, 1953, after claiming nearly 5 million lives.
The most recent event, sparked by the March 1st movement's nonviolent protests, was South Korea's Candlelight Revolution, from November 2016 to March 2017. The Candlelight Revolution was a series of demonstrations that called for President Park Geun-hye's impeachment. President Park was accused of playing a part in a scandal involving corruption, bribery, and abuse of power. 16 million people in total flooded the streets of South Korea for 20 consecutive Saturday nights, all armed with candles, not weapons. The citizens of South Korea were triumphant, and on March 11th of 2017, Park was removed from office.
Today, the March 1st movement is celebrated annually as a holiday in both North and South Korea, and is remembered as the time when millions of Koreans joined together under one goal. However, Korean and Japanese relations are still very bitter, and many Korean citizens still resent Japan for the time they occupied their country.
On January 15, 2019, New York State legislation passed a proposal to commemorate March 1st as Yuan-chun Day. This was a huge step in recognizing Yu Guan-chun as one of the greatest civil rights leaders of all time.
New York State Assembly member Edward Bronstein, one of the politicians that supported Yu Guan-chun Day, told us that, as an American who cherishes freedom and democracy, I think it is important for us to recognize individuals who fight for those values around the world.
The March 1st movement was a momentous event in Korean history that marked the start of the Korean independence movement.
Even though the March 1st movement was not successful in liberating Korea from Japanese rule, it was still a triumph because it led to the birth of the Korean Provisional Government.
It also gained worldwide attention and exposed Japan's brutal conduct towards the people of Korea. It also sparked other nonviolent demonstrations such as the Candlelight Revolution.
The March 1st movement is remembered as the first major act of resistance against the Japanese colonization, while also setting an example as an important series of nonviolent rallies.